I'm Lydia, and I'm 28 years old. 5 seconds before my future sister-in-law said I do, her real husband walked through those church doors in full military uniform. The look on her face when she saw him? Priceless. But let me back up, because this story starts way before today's little wedding surprise. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt completely invisible in your own family. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Growing up as the middle child in the Morrison family meant mastering the art of being overlooked. My older brother David was the golden boy. Harvard MBA, natural leader, destined to take over Dad's investment firm. My younger sister Emma was the baby, the artistic one who could do no wrong. And me? Well, I was just there. The dependable one who handled logistics while everyone else got the spotlight. When Dad announced his retirement plans 2 years ago, nobody was surprised when David got named as his successor. At 35, my brother had earned it. He was brilliant, driven, and had that natural charisma that made clients trust him with their life savings. What I didn't expect was how quickly his personal life would overshadow everything else. Enter Vanessa Clark. Stunning, sophisticated, and according to everyone who met her, absolutely perfect for David. She appeared at a charity gala last year like some kind of fairy tale princess, elegant in that effortless way that suggested money without being flashy about it. David was smitten from day one. "She's incredible, Lydia," he'd told me after their third date, his eyes lighting up like a teenager. Smart, independent, and she actually listens when I talk about work. Plus, she travels for her consulting business, so she understands the demands of my schedule. I should mention that David's previous girlfriend, Sarah, had broken up with him specifically because of those demands. Apparently, dating someone who worked 70-hour weeks and lived for quarterly projections wasn't as romantic as it sounded. But Vanessa seemed different. She never complained about his late nights, never demanded attention during busy seasons, and somehow always looked perfectly put together despite claiming to work remotely. The first time I met her was at David's apartment for Sunday dinner, a new tradition he'd started to bring family together more. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes late, apologizing about a client call that had run over. "I'm so sorry," she said, kissing David's cheek and turning to me with a brilliant smile. "You must be Lydia. David talks about you constantly," which was funny, because David had never mentioned me having any significant conversations about his new girlfriend. But I smiled back and played the supportive sister role I'd perfected over the years. "All good things, I hope." "Of course. He told me you're the one who keeps everyone organized. That must be exhausting." There it was. Subtle, but definitely there. The implication that being helpful was somehow a burden, that my role in the family was more obligation than choice. Most people wouldn't have caught it. But I'd been dealing with passive-aggressive comments my entire life. I knew a dig when I heard one. "Someone has to," I replied, keeping my voice light. "Otherwise, David would probably forget to eat." Vanessa laughed, but I noticed how quickly she changed the subject to her recent trip to Los Angeles. She had this way of steering conversations toward herself, while making it seem like she was just sharing experiences. By the end of dinner, we'd heard detailed stories about her consulting projects, her apartment renovation, and her upcoming business trips. But I realized I knew almost nothing concrete about her actual work. "What kind of consulting do you do exactly?" I asked as we cleared dishes. "Market analysis mostly, helping companies expand into new demographics." She waved her hand dismissively. "Pretty boring stuff, really. Not nearly as exciting as what David does." It was the kind of answer that sounded specific but revealed nothing. Like describing your job as business stuff, technically accurate but completely vague. When I'd later asked David if he'd ever visited her office or met her colleagues, he'd explain that she worked mostly with remote clients and preferred to keep work and personal life separate. "She says mixing business with romance killed her last relationship," he'd told me. I respect her boundaries. But David was gazing at her like she'd just solved world hunger, so I let it slide. That was my first mistake. Over the next few months, Vanessa seamlessly integrated herself into our family dynamic. Mom adored her. Such lovely manners, and she actually asks about my garden. Dad was impressed by her apparent business acumen, and Emma thought she was the coolest person alive because Vanessa had somehow befriended several Instagram influencers during her travels. I was the only one who seemed to notice the inconsistencies, like how she claimed to be lactose intolerant at family dinners but ordered cheese-heavy dishes when we went out to restaurants. Or how her emergency client calls always seemed to happen during family events, but never when she was alone with David. Or how she'd mention visiting cities for work that she'd later claim she'd never been to. When I brought up these discrepancies to David, he had explanations for everything. "She's probably just being polite about the lactose thing at family dinners," he said when I mentioned the food situation. And those client calls are why I respect her work ethic so much. She's dedicated. Right. Because nothing said dedicated professional like taking business calls during your boyfriend's sister's birthday party. But David was so completely smitten that he'd explicitly told me he didn't want to overthink his happiness. For once in my life, I'm not going to analyze everything to death, he'd said. I'm just going to trust what I feel. Which meant he actively avoided asking the kind of probing questions that had made him successful in business. Love had made him willfully blind. The real red flag came during Emma's art show opening. Vanessa arrived late, as usual, claiming her flight from Denver had been delayed. But when Emma mentioned a piece inspired by the Denver Art Museum, Vanessa looked completely blank. "Oh, I didn't have time for sightseeing," she said quickly. It was just a quick overnight trip. Except she'd told us at dinner the week before that she was staying in Denver for 4 days. When I casually mentioned this, she laughed it off. Did I say 4 days? God, I travel so much I can't keep anything straight. It was definitely just overnight. But I remembered because I'd specifically asked if she'd have time to visit the museum Emma had been raving about. David, of course, didn't remember the previous conversation and accepted her explanation without question. That's when I started paying closer attention. Not because I was jealous, despite what Vanessa would later claim, but because something felt fundamentally wrong. In my family, I might have been overlooked, but I wasn't stupid. And my gut was screaming that Vanessa Clark was not who she claimed to be. The engagement happened on New Year's Eve. David had planned this elaborate proposal at midnight, complete with champagne and our entire family present to witness the moment. When Vanessa said yes, through what appeared to be genuine tears, everyone cheered. Even I applauded, because despite my reservations, I wanted David to be happy. But as I watched her showing off the ring, a stunning vintage piece from our grandmother's collection, I caught something in her expression, just for a second. When she thought no one was looking, her smile shifted. It wasn't joy or love or overwhelming emotion. It was satisfaction, like a chess player who'd just achieved checkmate. "Isn't it gorgeous?" she gushed to Emma, angling her hand to catch the light. "David has such incredible taste." "It's beautiful," Emma agreed. Grandma Rose would have loved seeing it passed down. "Oh, David told me all about her," Vanessa said smoothly. "She sounds like she was an amazing woman," which was interesting because Grandma Rose had actually been Dad's mother, not Mom's, and she'd been notoriously difficult. David knew this, we all did. But apparently, he'd given Vanessa a sanitized version of family history. Or maybe she just hadn't been listening carefully enough to keep her story straight. I filed that detail away with all the others, building a mental catalog of inconsistencies that everyone else seemed determined to ignore. The wedding planning began immediately. Vanessa wanted everything to be perfect. And expensive. The venue, the flowers, the catering, the dress. For someone who claimed to be financially independent through her consulting work, she certainly had expensive taste. But David was happy to pay for everything, and our parents were thrilled to contribute. When Mom gently asked about Vanessa's guest list being so small, she'd gotten emotional about being an only child with no close family left. "I've always been more of a quality over quantity person with friendships," she'd explained. "I'd rather have Rachel, who truly knows me, than 50 acquaintances who are just there for the party." It was the perfect explanation that made our large, traditional family feel almost gauche for questioning her intimate approach. "She deserves the wedding of her dreams," Mom said when I accidentally mentioned the mounting costs. "David's finally found someone worthy of him. Worthy of him. As if David were some kind of prize that needed to be earned rather than a person who deserved to be loved for who he was." But that was typical family thinking. David was the golden boy, so naturally his partner had to be equally golden. What none of them seemed to consider was whether David was worthy of Vanessa. Or more importantly, whether Vanessa was actually who she claimed to be. The manipulations started subtly. Vanessa had a gift for making innocent comments that somehow managed to create doubt and discord. During wedding planning sessions, she'd make observations that seemed helpful, but were actually designed to isolate me from the rest of the family. "Lydia seems stressed lately," she'd tell Mom with genuine-sounding concern. "I hope she's not feeling overwhelmed by everything changing." Or to David, "Your sister asks a lot of questions about my work. I hope she doesn't feel like I'm taking too much of your attention." The brilliance of it was that she never said anything directly critical. She just planted seeds of doubt, then let everyone else's assumptions do the rest. Mom started watching me for signs of stress. David began interpreting my legitimate concerns as jealousy. Emma, caught in the middle, tried to smooth things over by suggesting I was just being protective. My personal favorite was when Vanessa told Dad I seemed to have strong opinions about the guest list. I'd simply asked why she wasn't inviting any family members to the wedding. "Oh, we're not close," she'd explained when I brought it up. "My parents passed away when I was young, and I don't really keep in touch with extended family." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation that also conveniently meant no one from her past would be present to potentially contradict her stories. But when Dad confronted me about making Vanessa uncomfortable with intrusive questions, I realized how effectively she'd turned my curiosity into evidence of bad behavior. I was just trying to get to know her better, I told him. By interrogating her about her family tragedy? Honestly, Lydia, I expected better from you. And just like that, I became the problem. Not the woman who couldn't keep her story straight or explain how she afforded her lifestyle. Me, for having the audacity to notice inconsistencies. The pattern continued through the spring. Vanessa would disappear for days at a time for work trips, then return with vague stories about client meetings and conference calls. When pressed for details, she'd deflect by mentioning how exhausted she was or how boring business travel could be. "I'm just grateful David understands," she'd say, squeezing his hand. "Some men would be jealous of all the traveling, but he respects my independence." What made her so convincing was that she had an answer for everything. When Mom wondered about her lack of family photos, Vanessa tearfully explained how painful it was to be reminded of her parents' death. When Dad casually asked about her business structure, she'd launch into just enough technical jargon to sound legitimate without providing real details. She was a master at giving people what they wanted to hear. Grief for Mom's sympathetic heart, business talk for Dad's analytical mind. David ate it up. In his mind, he'd found the perfect woman, beautiful, successful, and understanding of his own demanding career. The fact that her success was mysteriously unverifiable only made it more impressive to him. Meanwhile, my role in the family continued to shrink. Family dinners became focused on wedding planning, with me relegated to taking notes and handling logistics while Vanessa basked in attention. When I suggested cost-saving alternatives for the reception, I was accused of not wanting David to be happy. When I offered to help with research on vendors, I was told they had everything under control. "Maybe Lydia needs a hobby," Vanessa suggested sweetly during one particularly tense planning session, "something to keep her busy while we handle the wedding details." Because apparently, wanting to be included in my own brother's wedding preparations was a sign that I needed better ways to occupy my time. The breaking point came when David asked me to be a bridesmaid, not maid of honor. That position went to Vanessa's friend Rachel, someone none of us had met but who was apparently flying in from Seattle. But still, I was family, so I'd be included in the wedding party. "That's so generous of you," Vanessa said when David told me, especially considering how difficult this transition has been for Lydia. Transition. Like David getting married was some kind of corporate restructuring that I was struggling to adapt to, rather than a happy family milestone I wanted to celebrate. But I smiled and accepted the bridesmaid role. Because despite everything, I loved my brother and wanted to support him. Even if supporting him meant standing up for a woman I was increasingly certain was lying about everything. 3 months before the wedding, I decided to do some research of my own. Not because I wanted to sabotage anything, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that my family was about to make a terrible mistake. If I was wrong, I'd drop my concerns and apologize for doubting her. If I was right, well, I'd figure that out when I had proof. Finding information about Vanessa Clark proved surprisingly difficult. Her social media presence was minimal, just enough to seem normal without providing real details about her life. Her LinkedIn profile was vague, listing independent consulting, with no company names or specific achievements. When I searched for any professional presence online, I found virtually nothing. For someone supposedly successful enough to afford designer clothes and frequent travel, she had remarkably little digital footprint. In today's world, that was almost impossible unless you were actively hiding something. I started paying closer attention to her comings and goings. The pattern was always the same. She'd announce a business trip with minimal advance notice, disappear for anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks, then return with generic stories about meetings and client presentations. But she never brought home business cards, never mentioned specific companies, and never seemed to have any ongoing relationships with clients who might call or email. When David mentioned that Vanessa was considering relocating her business to be closer to him after the wedding, I saw an opportunity. "That's great," I said. "What kind of consulting does she do again? Maybe I could refer some clients from Dad's firm?" David looked surprised by the offer, which probably said something about how strained our relationship had become. "Market analysis and expansion strategies," he replied, "though I think she's pretty selective about her client base." Right. Selective enough to have no verifiable clients, apparently. 2 months before the wedding, I made a decision that would either prove I was paranoid or expose a massive deception. I hired a private investigator. It felt extreme, and I wrestled with the decision for weeks. This was my brother's fiancée, not some random person I suspected of fraud. But something about Vanessa's story didn't add up, and if she was lying about her identity or background, David deserved to know before he married her. The investigator, A former police detective named Marcus Webb was recommended by a friend who'd used his services during her divorce. He was expensive, but thorough. "I need you to understand something," he told me during our initial consultation. "If your suspicions are wrong, this could seriously damage your relationship with your family. Are you prepared for that possibility?" I thought about it seriously. Was I prepared to be wrong? To have spent money investigating someone who might just be private about her business dealings? To potentially destroy any remaining relationship with David? "Yes," I said finally. "If I'm wrong, I'll deal with the consequences. But if I'm right and I do nothing, the consequences could be much worse." Marcus took the case. What he found in the first week was disturbing enough to convince me I'd made the right choice. Vanessa Clark had no business licenses in any of the cities she'd claimed to work in. Her supposed consulting firm had no legal registration anywhere. The address she'd listed on various forms was a mailbox service in Portland. But the real discovery came when Marcus ran a more comprehensive background check. Vanessa Clark existed, but not in the way we thought. She had a social security number, a driver's license, and a clean credit report. She also had a marriage certificate, filed in Clark County, Nevada 2 years ago. To Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, currently stationed overseas with the U.S. Army, I stared at the document Marcus had uncovered, reading it over and over as if the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Vanessa was married. Had been married for 2 years, the entire time she'd been with David. "Are you sure this is the same person?" I asked, though the photo on the marriage certificate was unmistakably her. "Same social security number, same date of birth, same physical description," Marcus confirmed. "There's no question it's her." My hands shook as I processed the implications. This wasn't just deception, it was bigamy. If Vanessa went through with marrying David, she'd be committing a serious crime. And my brother, who prided himself on his integrity and professional reputation, would be unknowingly involved in fraud. "There's more," Marcus continued. "Staff Sergeant Torres is currently deployed but expected to return stateside next month. He's been sending regular support payments to an account in her name. So that's where her mysterious income came from. Not consulting fees, but military spouse benefits. She'd been living off her real husband's deployment pay while planning to marry my brother for his money. The brilliance of her scheme was almost admirable. In a horrifying way. She'd found a military spouse's perfect cover. A deployed husband who wouldn't be around to expose her lies, steady income that didn't require actual work, and the freedom to pursue a second relationship with someone wealthy enough to provide long-term financial security. I sat in my car outside Marcus's office for an hour, trying to figure out what to do with this information. I could confront Vanessa directly, but she'd probably just deny everything and convince David I was lying out of jealousy. I could tell David, but he was so infatuated he might not believe me without concrete proof. I could tell my parents, but they'd probably react the same way David would. Or I could wait and expose her publicly, in a way that would make denial impossible. The wedding was 6 weeks away. Armed with Marcus's findings, I found myself in an impossible position. I had proof that Vanessa was committing fraud, but no clear way to expose her without looking like the jealous sister everyone already thought I was. She'd played the manipulation game so well that my own family would probably assume I'd fabricated evidence rather than accept they'd been deceived. I needed more information before making any moves. Marcus continued his investigation, digging deeper into Vanessa's real life and her husband's military records. What he uncovered painted an even clearer picture of calculated deception. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres was a decorated soldier currently on his 3rd deployment in Afghanistan. He'd married Vanessa during a brief leave period, and from their electronic communications, which Marcus accessed through legal but questionable means, it was clear he had no idea about her relationship with David. His emails were full of plans for their future together when he returned stateside, excitement about buying a house, discussions of starting a family. Meanwhile, Vanessa was picking out china patterns for her wedding to my brother. The financial trail was equally damning. Torres had been sending monthly support payments that covered most of Vanessa's expenses, including the rent on an apartment I'd never heard her mention. She'd been maintaining a completely separate life, complete with different social media accounts, and what appeared to be an entirely different personality. In her communications with Torres, she was the devoted military wife, proud of his service and counting down days until his return. With David, she was the independent career woman who just happened to be available whenever he needed her. This level of compartmentalization requires serious planning, Marcus explained. She's essentially living 2 completely separate lives. That takes organization and psychological sophistication most people don't have, which explained why she'd been so good at manipulating our family dynamics. We'd been dealing with someone who was essentially a professional deceiver. The question remained, what was I going to do about it? I considered my options carefully. Confronting Vanessa directly would give her time to prepare a counter-narrative, or potentially disappear altogether. Telling David privately risked him warning her, either intentionally or accidentally. Going to my parents would likely result in them dismissing my concerns and possibly cutting me out of the wedding entirely. But there was another option, one that would make denial impossible and force everyone to confront the truth simultaneously. I could wait until the wedding day and let Torres expose her himself. Marcus had found contact information for Torres's commanding officer. A simple phone call explaining the situation would likely result in Torres being given emergency leave to handle the bigamy situation. The military took marriage fraud seriously, especially when it involved spousal benefits. The more I thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. Torres would arrive to find his wife in the middle of marrying another man. Vanessa would be caught red-handed with no way to explain or deflect. David would see the truth undeniably, and I would be vindicated without having to convince anyone of anything. It was risky. If something went wrong, if Torres couldn't make it or chose not to come, I'd be left with no backup plan and a family wedding to endure while knowing the bride was a fraud. But it was also poetic justice, letting Vanessa's own deception be the instrument of her exposure. 3 weeks before the wedding, I made the call. This is unusual, Torres's commanding officer admitted after I explained the situation. But if what you're saying is true, Sergeant Torres has a right to know. Bigamy affects military benefits and could impact his security clearance. Within 48 hours, Torres was granted emergency leave. Marcus tracked his travel arrangements. He'd be arriving in town the morning of the wedding, planning to surprise his wife with an early return from deployment. The timing wasn't accidental. I'd specifically requested that Torres be informed about the ceremony schedule, suggesting he might want to verify the situation in person. I didn't tell him to interrupt the wedding. I just made sure he knew when and where Vanessa would be making her illegal vows. I almost felt sorry for him. He had no idea he was walking into a nightmare. 2 weeks before the wedding, Vanessa disappeared again on another mysterious business trip. This time, I suspected she was tying up loose ends, possibly even meeting with Torres to maintain her fiction. But she returned on schedule with the usual vague stories about client meetings, and wedding preparations continued normally. David was radiating happiness. Mom was in full hostess mode, coordinating details with military precision. Dad was proud of his son's choice and excited to welcome Vanessa officially into the family. Emma was practicing her reading for the ceremony and planning her bridesmaid duties. And I was counting down days until their world exploded. The guilt was overwhelming. These people I loved were about to experience a betrayal that would shake their faith in their own judgment. David, especially, was going to be devastated. But they deserved the truth, even if it was going to hurt. 1 week before the wedding, Vanessa asked to meet with me privately. I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, she said over coffee at a neutral location, but I want to clear the air before I officially become part of your family. Here it was, my chance to confront her directly, to give her an opportunity to confess and call off the wedding voluntarily. For a moment, I considered laying out everything I knew and demanding she tell David the truth. Instead, I smiled and said, I just want David to be happy. So do I, she replied. And for the first time, I thought I detected genuine emotion in her voice. He's an amazing man. I'm lucky to have found him. The twisted thing was, I almost believed her in that moment. Maybe she had developed real feelings for David, even while maintaining her deception. Maybe she was trapped in a web of lies that had grown beyond her control. But then she smiled that perfect, practiced smile, and I remembered that everything about her was calculated. Even this conversation was probably strategic, designed to neutralize any remaining threat I might pose to her plans. I think you'll make a beautiful bride, I told her, and I meant it. She was going to look absolutely stunning when her world came crashing down. The final week before the wedding passed in a blur of last-minute preparations and mounting tension. Vanessa threw herself into bride mode with the kind of intensity that suggested she was either genuinely excited or desperately committed to maintaining her performance. Given what I knew, I suspected the latter. She had final dress fittings, confirmed catering details, and supervised the decoration of the church and reception venue. To anyone watching, she seemed like a woman living her dream. Only I knew she was actually orchestrating an elaborate fraud. The rehearsal dinner was held 2 nights before the wedding at our country club. Vanessa had invited about 30 people, including her friend Rachel, who'd flown in from Seattle to serve as maid of honor. Rachel was perfectly pleasant, a marketing executive with normal social media presence and verifiable employment. Everything Vanessa pretended to be. During the dinner, I watched Vanessa work the room like a politician at a fundraiser. She had personal conversations with each guest, remembered details about their lives, and made everyone feel special and included. She was charming, gracious, and completely convincing. Your brother is so lucky, Rachel told me during cocktails. Vanessa talks about him constantly. I've never seen her this happy. Which raised the uncomfortable question of how much Rachel knew about Vanessa's real situation. Was she complicit in the deception or another victim of Vanessa's manipulation? How long have you two been friends? I asked, fishing for information. About 2 years, Rachel replied. We met through a networking group for women entrepreneurs. Vanessa was just starting her consulting business then. So Rachel's entire friendship was based on lies too. I almost felt sorry for her. The evening proceeded smoothly until David stood to give his rehearsal dinner speech. Watching him talk about finding his soulmate and looking forward to spending his life with someone who shared his values was almost unbearable. He was so sincere, so genuinely happy, that I had to excuse myself to the restroom to compose myself. When I returned, Vanessa was at the microphone, giving her own speech about finding her forever home with the Morrison family. I've always believed that family is chosen, not just inherited, she said, looking directly at me, and I'm grateful that this family has chosen to embrace me, even when it might have been easier to be cautious. The implication was clear. I had been the cautious one, the suspicious one, the one who'd made embracing her difficult. Even now, she was working the narrative to her advantage. But in less than 48 hours, caution would be vindicated. The morning of the wedding, I woke up with a knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with bridesmaid duties. By now, Torres would be en route to what he thought was a surprise reunion with his wife. He had no idea he was about to walk into a wedding ceremony where she was marrying someone else. Marcus had confirmed Torres's flight arrival and estimated he'd reach the church around the time the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The timing would be dramatic, but I hadn't left it entirely to chance. I'd made sure Torres had all the information he needed to arrive at the most impactful moment. I got dressed in my bridesmaid gown, a beautiful sage green that Vanessa had chosen to complement her complexion, and headed to the church for photos. The morning was sunny and perfect. Exactly what every bride dreams of for her wedding day. Vanessa looked stunning in her dress, a classic A-line with delicate beading that probably cost more than most people's cars. She was calm, focused, and showing no signs of the stress someone might expect from a woman about to commit bigamy in front of 200 witnesses. You look beautiful, I told her, as her photographer captured getting ready shots. Thank you, Lydia. I know we've had our differences, but I hope you know how much it means to me that you're here today. She was good. Even knowing what I knew, I was almost moved by what seemed like genuine emotion. If I didn't have documented proof of her deception, I might have wondered if I'd misjudged her entirely. But I did have proof, and in about an hour, everyone else would too. The guests began arriving as we finished photos. I spotted several of Dad's business associates, college friends of David's, and extended family members I hadn't seen in years. Everyone was dressed in their finest, excited to witness what they believed would be a beautiful celebration of true love. Mom was radiant in her mother of the groom outfit, greeting guests and making sure every detail was perfect. Dad looked distinguished in his tuxedo, ready to officially welcome his new daughter-in-law. Emma was vibrating with excitement about her role as ceremony reader. And David? David looked like a man who'd won the lottery. Standing at the altar in his perfectly tailored tux, he kept checking his watch and smiling at the door, eager for his bride to appear. I took my place as a bridesmaid, holding my bouquet and trying to keep my expression neutral. Any minute now, the music would start, and Vanessa would begin her walk down the aisle toward a marriage that was already legally impossible. The church doors opened and Vanessa appeared with Dad, who was giving her away since her own father was supposedly deceased. She was breathtaking, gliding down the aisle like something from a fairy tale while the congregation stood in appreciation. David's face when he saw her was pure joy. This was supposed to be the happiest moment of his life. The minister began the ceremony with traditional words about love, commitment, and the sacred bond of marriage. Vanessa and David exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. The irony was almost overwhelming. If anyone has reasons why these two should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace, the minister intoned. On cue, the church doors burst open. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, in full dress uniform, walked purposefully down the aisle with a folder of documents in his hand. The silence was deafening, but that's when things got really interesting. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres stood at the back of the church, his dress uniform pristine and his expression deadly serious. In his hand, he held a manila folder that I knew contained the documents that would end Vanessa's performance forever. The congregation turned in their seats, confused murmurs rippling through the sanctuary. David looked bewildered, his eyes darting between his bride and the uniformed stranger who'd just interrupted their ceremony. Vanessa had gone completely pale, her bouquet trembling in her hands. "Vanessa Torres!" Michael called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "We need to talk." The use of her married name hit the congregation like a physical blow. You could feel the shift in the room's energy as people began to understand that something was very, very wrong. "I'm sorry," the minister said, clearly flustered. "But this is a private ceremony. If you could please—" "Actually, Reverend, this is exactly where I need to be," Torres interrupted, walking steadily down the aisle. "Because the woman at that altar is already married. To me." The gasps from the congregation were audible now. I saw Mom's hand fly to her chest, Dad's face drain of color, and Emma's mouth drop open in shock. David stood frozen at the altar, trying to process what he was hearing. Vanessa finally found her voice. "I don't know who this man is," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "This is clearly some kind of mistake or—" "No mistake." "Vanessa!" Torres had reached the front of the church now, close enough that everyone could see the family resemblance in the couple's wedding photos he pulled from his folder. "Married in Las Vegas, Nevada on March 15th, 2 years ago. Clark County Marriage Certificate number 47291. He held up the official document for everyone to see. Even from my position as a bridesmaid, I could make out the signatures and official seals that made it unmistakably legitimate. "You've been receiving my military spouse benefits for the past 24 months, he continued, his voice getting stronger, "including the $1,500 I sent just last week for what you told me was our anniversary gift to each other." David finally found his voice. "What the hell is going on here?" Torres turned to address him directly, man to man. "Sir, I'm sorry you're finding out this way, but your bride is my wife, legally married for 2 years. I've been deployed overseas, and I came home early specifically to surprise her." He gestured toward Vanessa with a bitter smile. "Looks like I'm the one who got surprised." The church had erupted into whispered conversations, as guests tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. I caught fragments of shocked exclamations and confused questions, but my focus was entirely on Vanessa. She was trapped, and she knew it. Her carefully constructed facade was crumbling in real time, and there was nowhere to run. No amount of charm or manipulation could explain away a legal marriage certificate presented by her actual husband. "This is insane," she said, her voice rising with what sounded like genuine panic. "I've never seen this man before in my life. This has to be some kind of fraud or identity theft or—" Torres pulled out his phone and showed the screen to David, then to the minister, then to my father. "These are text messages from her phone number, from yesterday, telling me how much she missed me and couldn't wait for me to come home." The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and public. Exactly what I'd hoped for, though seeing it play out was more dramatic than even I had anticipated. David looked like someone had physically struck him. The realization that he'd been living a lie for over a year was written all over his face, confusion giving way to understanding, understanding giving way to betrayal, betrayal giving way to rage. "Vanessa," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "is this true?" For a moment, I thought she might continue denying everything, but looking at Torres in his military dress uniform, holding official government documents and presenting a mountain of evidence, even Vanessa couldn't maintain the pretense. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely defeated. "I can explain," she whispered. But explanation was the last thing anyone wanted to hear. The church had descended into chaos. Guests were standing now, craning their necks to get a better view of the drama unfolding at the altar. Some people were already pulling out their phones, and I realized this disaster was about to become very public very quickly. "Explain?" David's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Explain how you're married to someone else while standing here trying to marry me? Explain how you've been lying about literally everything for over a year?" Vanessa looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route or someone who might help her. But the walls of her deception had finally closed in completely. "It's not what you think," she said, though her voice lacked any conviction. "Michael and we got married when we were young. It was impulsive. We barely knew each other. And when he deployed, I thought—" "You thought what?" Torres stepped closer, his military bearing making him seem even more imposing. "That you could just pretend I didn't exist? That you could spend my deployment pay while shopping for a richer husband?" The financial revelation hit the congregation like another bombshell. I watched realization dawn on my father's face as he connected the dots about Vanessa's mysterious income source. "The consulting business?" Dad said, more to himself than anyone else. "There never was a consulting business." Torres shook his head grimly. "She's been living off my military salary and benefits while I've been deployed. Every month, I've been sending money home to support what I thought was my wife building our future together." He pulled out more documents from his folder. Bank statements showing regular deposits from the U.S. Army, An apartment lease in Portland that I've been paying for. Health insurance claims filed under my military benefits. The systematic nature of the fraud was becoming clear to everyone. This wasn't just a woman who'd made some poor choices. This was someone who'd constructed an elaborate scheme to defraud both her legal husband and her intended victim. How long? David asked, his voice hollow. How long were you planning to keep this going? Vanessa's composure finally cracked completely. Tears began streaming down her face, though whether they were genuine or performative was impossible to tell. I was going to tell you, she said desperately. I was going to file for divorce and make everything legal before we got married. I just needed more time to figure out how to… To what? How to explain to your deployed husband that you were leaving him for someone with more money. Torres's disgust was evident in every word. I've been in Afghanistan for 8 months, Vanessa, dodging bullets and missing you every single day while you've been planning a wedding to another man. The cruelty of it was staggering. While Torres had been serving his country and faithfully supporting his wife, she'd been systematically deceiving everyone around her to secure a more lucrative future. Mom had made her way to the front of the church, her face a mixture of shock and horror. Vanessa, honey, surely there's been some misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding. Mrs. Morrison, Torres said gently but firmly. Your son has been dating a married woman who's been committing benefits fraud with the U.S. military. This isn't a relationship gone wrong. It's organized deception. Emma was crying now, whether from the shock of the revelation or the destruction of what she'd thought was a beautiful love story. The guests were openly staring, some beginning to file out of the church as they realized this wasn't going to be resolved quickly or quietly. David stood at the altar in his wedding tuxedo, surrounded by flowers and candles, and all the trappings of what should have been the happiest day of his life. Instead, he looked like a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. The trips, he said suddenly, pieces clicking into place. All those business trips, you were visiting him. Vanessa shook her head frantically. No, that's not… sometimes I had to maintain the appearance of being married to your actual husband while you were planning to marry me for my money. David's voice was getting stronger, fueled by growing anger. Do you have any idea what you've done? To me? To my family? To him? He gestured toward Torres, who was standing with military precision despite the emotional chaos around him. Sir, Torres addressed David directly. I want you to know I had no idea about any of this. If I had known she was involved with someone else, I would have handled this very differently. The respect and dignity Torres was showing in an impossible situation only made Vanessa's deception seem more reprehensible. Here was a man who'd been betrayed just as thoroughly as David, but he was conducting himself with honor while his wife fell apart under the weight of her lies. But Vanessa wasn't finished yet. I could see something shifting in her expression, the tears stopping, her posture straightening slightly. She was regrouping, preparing for one last desperate gambit, and I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly what it would be. Vanessa wiped her tears with the back of her hand and took a deep breath. When she looked up, her expression had transformed from defeated to defiant. The victim mask was gone, replaced by something harder and more desperate. You know what? She said, her voice gaining strength. You want to know whose fault this really is? She turned and pointed directly at me, her fingers shaking with either rage or adrenaline. This is all because of her. Lydia couldn't stand that her perfect brother found someone who actually loved him. She's been sabotaging us from day one. The accusation hit the church like a lightning bolt. Every head turned toward me, and I felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes suddenly focused in my direction. Even Torres looked confused by this sudden turn. She hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on me, Vanessa continued, her voice rising to near hysteria. She's been plotting this for months because she can't stand that David chose me over his precious family. The brilliant thing about her strategy was that it contained just enough truth to be believable. I had hired Marcus Webb. I had been investigating her background. To someone who didn't know the full context, it might sound like jealous sister behavior rather than legitimate concern. Lydia has always been jealous of David's success, she pressed on, playing to years of family dynamics that she'd observed and exploited. And when he found real love, she couldn't handle not being the center of attention anymore. I watched my family's faces as they processed this accusation. Mom looked confused and hurt, clearly torn between what she was hearing and what she'd witnessed. Dad's expression was unreadable. Emma was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. And David was looking at me with something that might have been doubt. Is that true, Lydia? He asked quietly. Did you hire someone to investigate Vanessa? The question hung in the air like a sword over my head. This was the moment Vanessa had been building toward, turning the truth into a weapon against me. If I admitted to the investigation without proper context, I'd look exactly like the jealous, vindictive sister she was painting me as. But if I denied it, Torres was standing right there with evidence that would contradict any lies I might tell. Yes, I said simply. I did. The congregation erupted in whispers and shocked exclamations. Vanessa's face lit up with vindictive satisfaction. There! She said triumphantly. She's been planning this humiliation for months. She couldn't bear that David was happy, so she decided to destroy our wedding. It was a masterful manipulation, turning her own criminal behavior into my fault. She was betting that my family's existing perception of me as the difficult sister would make them believe her version of events rather than considering why I might have felt compelled to investigate. She's sick, Vanessa continued, really hitting her stride now, obsessed with controlling David's life because she can't stand that he doesn't need her anymore. This whole thing is her twisted revenge for not being the most important woman in his life. The psychology of it was brilliant and horrifying. She was taking every insecurity I'd ever had about my place in the family and weaponizing it against me, making my legitimate concerns sound like pathological jealousy. Lydia, Mom said, her voice thick with disappointment. How could you do something like this? On your brother's wedding day? And there it was. Even faced with evidence of Vanessa's bigamy and fraud, my mother's first instinct was to blame me for exposing it. The family dynamics Vanessa had exploited so expertly were still in play, even now. Torres looked completely bewildered by this turn in the conversation. Ma'am, he said, addressing Vanessa directly. I don't understand what your sister-in-law has to do with the fact that you're married to me. But Vanessa was on a roll now, playing her final card with everything she had. She probably paid this man to pretend to be my husband, she said desperately. She's sick enough to hire actors to destroy my life. Look at him. Does he look like someone I'd marry? The insult to Torres was so casual and cruel that several people in the congregation actually gasped. Here was a decorated soldier who'd been faithfully supporting her while she planned to commit bigamy, and she was dismissing him as beneath her standards. Torres's expression hardened. Ma'am, I have our marriage certificate, joint tax returns, and 2 years of bank records. If your sister-in-law somehow fabricated all of that along with my military service record, she's the most sophisticated criminal mastermind in history. His dry delivery almost made me smile, despite the circumstances. Almost. Don't you see what she's doing? Vanessa pleaded with David. She's turning you against me with lies and manipulation. She can't stand that you love someone more than you love her. But something had shifted in the room's energy. The desperation in Vanessa's accusations was becoming obvious, and people were starting to see through her performance. More importantly, David was starting to see through it too. I could watch the pieces clicking into place in his mind, not just about Vanessa's deception, but about the months of manipulation that had led to this moment, the seeds of doubt she'd planted about me, the way she'd isolated him from his family, the systematic campaign to make him question my motives. He wasn't looking at me with doubt anymore. He was looking at Vanessa with recognition. David stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, processing everything that had been revealed in the past 10 minutes. The church had gone quiet, except for occasional whispers and the sound of people shifting in their seats. Vanessa was breathing heavily, having expended all her energy on her desperate accusation against me. When David finally spoke, his voice was calm in a way that was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been shouting. Vanessa, he said slowly, what was the name of my grandmother who supposedly gave you her ring? The question seemed to come out of nowhere, and Vanessa looked confused by the change in subject. Your grandmother Rose, she stammered. You told me she was an amazing woman. My grandmother Rose was my father's mother, David continued in that same eerily calm voice. And she was actually a miserable, bitter woman who made everyone's life difficult until the day she died. The ring belonged to my mother's mother, Grandma Helen, who I never once mentioned to you. You could hear a pin drop in the church. Even the whispers had stopped. You've been wearing Helen Morrison's ring this entire time, and you've never once asked about her, because you weren't actually interested in our family history. You were just playing a role. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The small detail that had seemed insignificant months ago was now demolishing what remained of her credibility. And Lydia, David continued, turning toward me for the first time, when exactly did you hire this investigator? I met his eyes steadily. 2 months ago. 2 months ago, he repeated. When I mentioned you seemed to have a lot of questions about Vanessa's work, questions that Vanessa told me were making her uncomfortable. He turned back to his bride, and I could see the full realization dawning on his face. You told me my sister was jealous. You said she couldn't handle me being happy. You suggested she needed hobbies to keep her busy while we planned our wedding. His voice was getting stronger, more certain with each revelation. You systematically turned me against my own sister, so I wouldn't listen when she tried to warn me about you. Vanessa was shaking her head frantically. David, no, that's not. Every conversation, he continued, speaking over her protests. Every family dinner where I felt like Lydia was being difficult. Every time I dismissed her concerns as jealousy. You orchestrated all of it. The pieces of Vanessa's manipulation were falling into place not just for David, but for everyone listening. The months of subtle comments designed to isolate me from my family were being exposed as calculated strategy, rather than innocent observations. You poisoned my relationship with my sister, David said, his voice filled with a growing anger that was all the more powerful for being controlled. You made me doubt someone I've known my entire life so I wouldn't notice that you were lying about everything. Torres, who had been watching this revelation with obvious confusion, stepped forward slightly. Sir, if I may, she did the same thing to me. Told me her family was unsupportive of our marriage because they didn't approve of military spouses. Said her sister specifically had made cruel comments about my deployment pay. More gasps from the congregation. Vanessa had been playing the same manipulation game on both sides, turning her legal husband against his own character while turning my family against me. She told you I was jealous of her success, I said quietly, addressing David directly. But she told Torres that I looked down on his military service. She made everyone the villain in each other's stories. David closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, they were filled with something I hadn't seen from him in months. Clarity. Jesus Christ. Vanessa, he whispered. What kind of person does that? What kind of person systematically destroys relationships for sport? I never meant, she started, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. You meant every word of it. You planned every conversation, every manipulation, every lie. His voice was getting stronger again. You turned me into someone who doubted his own sister. You made me complicit in isolating someone I love because it served your purposes. He looked around the church, taking in the faces of our family, our friends, and the business associates who'd come to celebrate what they thought was his happiness. Do you know what the worst part is? He asked, though it was clearly rhetorical. The worst part is that I was so eager to believe I'd found someone who loved me for who I am that I ignored every red flag. I wanted the fairy tale so badly that I let you convince me my own family was the problem. Vanessa was crying again, but this time there was no performance to it. These were the tears of someone watching their world collapse completely and finally understanding that there was no way out. But David wasn't finished. You're right about one thing, Vanessa. My sister did investigate you. And thank God she did, because she saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life. He turned toward me, and for the first time in months, I saw my brother looking at me with respect instead of suspicion. I'm sorry, Lydia, he said, his voice cracking slightly. I'm so sorry I let her turn me against you. I should have trusted you. I should have listened. The apology I'd been waiting months to hear was finally coming, but not in any way I'd ever imagined it would. The church was absolutely silent now, everyone holding their breath as David composed himself for what was clearly going to be his final words to the woman he'd planned to marry. When he spoke again, his voice carried across the sanctuary with the kind of authority I remembered from our childhood. My big brother taking charge of a situation and making sure everyone understood exactly where they stood. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, addressing the congregation directly, I owe all of you an apology for bringing you here under false pretenses. You came to celebrate what you thought was a marriage between two people who loved each other. Instead, you've witnessed the exposure of someone who has built her entire life on deception and manipulation. He gestured toward Vanessa, who was standing frozen at the altar in her beautiful wedding dress, looking like a deer caught in headlights. This woman is not who any of us thought she was. She's not an independent businesswoman. She's not someone who fell in love and made some mistakes. She's a fraud who has systematically manipulated everyone in this room, including me, for over a year. The congregation was riveted, hanging on every word. Some people were recording on their phones, though whether for personal memory or to share later, I couldn't tell. She convinced me that my sister was jealous and vindictive, David continued, his voice growing stronger. She made me doubt my own family's judgment because questioning her story meant questioning everything I wanted to believe about my own happiness. He turned to face Vanessa directly, and the look in his eyes was one I'd never seen before. Not anger, not hurt, but something colder and more final. You want to know who the real failure is in this room, Vanessa? It's not my sister, who worked to protect her family even when it made her look like the villain. It's not my parents, who welcomed you with open arms because they trusted my judgment. It's not even Torres, who served his country while faithfully supporting someone who was betraying him every single day. His voice rose slightly, carrying to every corner of the church. The failure is you. You had a husband who loved you enough to send you his deployment pay from a war zone. You had a family that was ready to embrace you as a daughter and sister. You had every opportunity to build something real and honest, and instead you chose to be a con artist. The words hit Vanessa like physical blows. She was shaking now, whether from rage or fear or simple shock at being exposed so completely and publicly. "David, please," she tried one last time. "No." His voice was flat, final. "You don't get to please your way out of this. You committed fraud against the United States military. You attempted to commit bigamy in front of 200 witnesses. You've destroyed the trust of everyone who cared about you, and you did it all for money." He pulled the engagement ring, our grandmother's ring, from his pocket and handed it to our father. "This belongs to our family, not to someone who sees us as marks to be conned." He looked around the church one more time. "There will be no wedding today. There will be no reception. What there will be is a conversation with law enforcement about benefits fraud and attempted bigamy." The threat of legal consequences seemed to finally penetrate Vanessa's shock. Her face went white, and for the first time she looked genuinely afraid rather than just cornered. "As for my sister," David continued, turning toward me with an expression I hadn't seen in over a year. "Lydia, I failed you. I let someone I'd known for 12 months convince me to doubt someone I've known my entire life. I prioritized my own happiness over your well-being, and I'm ashamed of that." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and I felt tears starting in my own eyes. "You tried to protect me, and I punished you for it. You saw through her lies when I was too infatuated to think clearly. You did the hard thing, the unpopular thing, because you love me enough to risk our relationship rather than let me make a terrible mistake." He stepped closer to me, and for the first time in months, I saw my brother clearly. Not the love-struck man who'd been manipulated into doubting his own family, but the person I'd grown up with and trusted completely. "Can you forgive me?" he asked simply. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "The only person who deserves an apology from this family," he said, turning back to address the congregation, "is Staff Sergeant Torres, who served his country honorably while his wife was planning to defraud both of us." Torres stepped forward slightly, his military bearing intact despite the emotional chaos around him. "Sir, you don't owe me an apology. We were both victims of the same deception. I'm just grateful your sister had the courage to expose it before you made the same mistake I did." The respect in his voice when he mentioned me was something I'd remember for years to come. David nodded, then looked around the church one final time. "To everyone who came here today expecting to celebrate love and commitment, I'm sorry you had to witness this instead. But I'd rather discover the truth in front of all of you than spend years living a lie." With that, he turned and walked down the aisle, leaving Vanessa standing alone at the altar in her wedding dress, surrounded by the ruins of her carefully constructed deception. The show was over. The aftermath moved quickly, as these things tend to do once the truth comes out. Torres contacted the military police to report the benefits fraud, and by evening, Vanessa was facing both civilian charges for attempted bigamy and military investigation for spouse benefits fraud. The legal consequences alone would follow her for years, but the social consequences were immediate and devastating. Word spread through our social circles within hours. By the next morning, the story was being whispered about in country clubs, office buildings, and coffee shops across the city. Vanessa's reputation was destroyed completely, not just as someone who'd made poor choices, but as someone who'd systematically defrauded multiple people while maintaining an elaborate facade. The financial losses were equally swift. The wedding vendors, the reception venue, the honeymoon reservations, everything had to be canceled, and most deposits were forfeited. Vanessa lost access to David's accounts, of course, and when Torres filed for divorce, he also reported the fraud to their bank and credit card companies. Within a week, she'd gone from planning a luxurious life as the wife of a successful businessman to facing legal bills she couldn't afford and a reputation that would follow her everywhere. But honestly, watching her lose everything wasn't nearly as satisfying as watching my family heal. The conversation David and I had the day after the wedding was one of the most important of our lives. He didn't just apologize. He took responsibility for how completely he'd allowed himself to be manipulated, and more importantly, for how he'd let that manipulation damage our relationship. "I keep thinking about all the times you tried to warn me," he said as we sat in his apartment, surrounded by returned wedding gifts. "Every question you asked that I dismissed as jealousy. Every concern you raised that she convinced me was you being difficult. You were in love," I told him, though part of me was still hurt by how quickly he'd turned against me. People do stupid things when they're in love. No, that's not an excuse. Love doesn't make you doubt your family's character. Manipulation does. He shook his head, still processing everything. She was so good at it, Lydia. Every conversation was designed to make me see you as the problem rather than questioning her stories. What struck me most about our reconciliation was how relieved David seemed. Not just about escaping Vanessa's deception, but about rebuilding his relationship with me. It was like he'd been carrying the weight of doubting his own family without even realizing it. Mom and Dad were horrified when they understood the full scope of how they'd been played. Dad especially was furious with himself for not trusting his own business instincts when Vanessa's financial stories didn't add up. "I've been evaluating people's financial claims for 30 years, he said during our first family dinner after everything came out. I should have seen through her immediately. But that was the genius of Vanessa's approach. She'd told everyone what they wanted to hear while making me the villain for questioning any of it. The most surprising outcome was how the experience affected David's leadership at the company. Rather than being embarrassed by the public nature of the scandal, he handled it with a transparency and integrity that actually strengthened client confidence. He acknowledged that he'd been deceived, explained the steps he was taking to ensure it never happened again, and demonstrated exactly the kind of character people want in someone managing their money. If anything, one longtime client told Dad, "Seeing how David handled this situation makes me trust him more, not less." Anyone can be fooled by a professional con artist, but not everyone has the character to admit it publicly and make things right. 6 months later, David's business was stronger than ever, and our family had settled into a new normal that was actually healthier than before. The experience had forced all of us to examine how we communicated and how we treated each other's concerns. Emma, who'd been devastated by the wedding disaster, eventually told me it had taught her an important lesson about trusting her instincts. "I knew something felt wrong about Vanessa," she admitted, "but everyone else seemed so sure about her that I figured I was just being paranoid. As for me, I won't lie. There was enormous satisfaction in being vindicated so completely and publicly. For months, I'd been painted as the jealous, difficult sister who couldn't handle her brother's happiness. Having the truth come out in such an undeniable way felt like the universe finally setting the record straight. But the real victory wasn't proving I'd been right about Vanessa. It was getting my brother back. The morning after the wedding, I'd woken up expecting to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt something much better. Relief. Relief that David was safe. Relief that our family was whole again. Relief that I'd trusted my instincts even when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Vanessa had spent over a year trying to convince everyone that I was the problem, the obstacle, the failure. In the end, all she'd managed to prove was that sometimes the person asking uncomfortable questions is the one who loves you most. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually. Sometimes it takes a decorated soldier walking into a church to make that happen, but it always finds a way. And sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's just standing quietly while someone else's lies collapse under their own weight. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories about family drama, toxic relationships, and the satisfaction that comes when the truth finally comes out. Sometimes the people who love us most are the ones asking the hardest questions.